Hello, all you ranters, ravers, and rock and rollers. This is Jim Cherry with this week's article of my rock and roll book recommendations. This past week, Lisa and Nancy were talking to guests from the Utica Music and Arts Festival, and they talked to a lot of independent and up-and-coming bands from there. So my first idea for this article would be my list of up-and-coming bands. But as I was writing the article, I realized it's been a long time since I hung out with any up-and-coming bands. And then there are groups named Thor, Scratch Happy, and Pieces of Fate. So you can see I haven't been real good at picking bands who I can ride their coattails to the top. So I thought I'd talk about something that I knew about, rock and roll books. Now the first one I want to talk about is Louis Shiner's Glimpses. Glimpses is the story of Ray Shackelford, an alcoholic stereo repairman who discovers he can move back and forth in time. And what he does is he goes back to meet his favorite rock stars such as Brian Wilson, Jim Morrison, and Jimi Hendrix, and he helps them recreate their lost albums, such as the Beach Boys' Smile album, the Doors' Celebration of the Lizard, or Jimi Hendrix's last planned album, New Rays of the Rising Sun. Glimpses is so good that I read it once a year for the first 3 years after discovering it. The next book I want to talk about is also by Louis Shiner, his Say Goodbye. Say Goodbye was billed as a rock and roll Citizen Kane. It follows the fictional life of indie music star Laurie Moss, from her coffeehouse roots to the top of the music business, with stops along the way for falling in love with a washed-up guitar hero, to the perils of the music business itself. Say Goodbye is a light, entertaining read with a lot of insight into the indie music scene. Shiner recently has published definitive versions of both Glimpses and Say Goodbye, both of which you can find on Amazon. The next book I want to talk about is Jim Carroll's The Petting Zoo. Jim Morrison wanted to be Rambo, but Jim Carroll was Rambo. Carroll, who was a punk poet who wrote the Basketball Diaries when he was a teenager. His first and last novel, The Petting Zoo, follows the story of painter Billy Wolfram, who suffers a mental breakdown on the eve of his breakthrough exhibition. He escapes to a mental hospital where he meets a crow that has ancient ties to the story of mankind. Now, at first, I was a little wary about The Petting Zoo because poets, sometimes their use of words doesn't translate well to fiction. But Carroll really makes the story work, and you empathize with Billy Wolfram right from beginning to end of the story. Jim Carroll died as he was writing this book. One of his a contemporary of Jim Carroll's was Patti Smith, and she also has a new book out, Just Kids. Just Kids is a moving memoir of Smith's life in the 60s and early 70s, when she and Robert Mapplethorpe were living and loving together and trying to make it as artists in New York City. It's a touching portrait Smith paints and an homage to her friend Robert Mapplethorpe. Sticking with memoirs is Keith Richards' Life. If there's anyone in rock and roll who shouldn't be alive to tell his story with everything he's been through, it's Keith Richards, who possibly had every bad habit a rock star could have, plus a few new ones. But in life, Richards tells his story from his childhood to being Johnny Depp's father in Pirates of the Caribbean. And after all the years of abuse and decadence Richards has been through, he hasn't been reduced to the mutterings of an Ozzy Osbourne. With friend and ghostwriter James Fox guiding the way, Richard's story is highly readable and his voice is clearly audible and present throughout the book. The last book I want to talk about is Ron Clooney's Mr. Mojo Rising. Mr. Mojo Rising is the story of a journalist who meets Jim Morrison at a bar outside of Père Lachaise Cemetery after Jim Morrison is supposed to be dead. So the journalist, knowing that he's on the story of a lifetime, starts tracking down and pursuing Jim Morrison. If there is, in rock and roll books, if there is a subgenre of Jim Morrison's alive books, such as Ray Manzarek's The Poet in Exile, pretty much The Poet in Exile was a novel of missed opportunities. But Clooney isn't missing any of those opportunities and has written a taut thriller. It will be available from Amazon October 1st. And if you are looking for a recommendation for a new up-and-coming band, check out The Theory of Noise on YouTube. And I'm Jim Cherry for Rants, Raves, and Rock and Roll Magazine. Thank you.